All right, ladies and gentlemen, in our next segment, we're going to be talking more about what smart on crime actually means. And we're going to be breaking this down by 4 principles to define what has been, in some situations, a slogan. And the 4 principles that the steering committee discussed and came up with as we're coming up with this conference was to promote fair laws and the fair enforcement of laws that uphold and protect constitutional rights, ensure that criminal justice strategies are effective and driven by evidence and data, pursue just and proportional responses to crime that eliminate disparate impacts of the criminal justice system, bolster comprehensive prevention and reentry investments to reduce recidivism and close opportunity gaps. And these are 4 principles that the steering committee, which is made up of people from across the ideological spectrum and the political spectrum, agreed on. And so we're going to bring here 4 groups of presenters to talk individually about each of those principles. To describe the smart on crime principle of fair laws and the fair enforcement of laws, please welcome the former head of the U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division and the current president and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, VANITA GUPTA.
Good morning. Great to see everyone. So I'm going to start with a photo that we have been seeing a lot in the news of late. So amidst the current controversy, I think one thing that's getting forgotten about the NFL players and other athletes that have been taking a knee is that they have been taking a knee out of protest against police violence against unarmed African-American men and the lack of accountability and justice that in the system to hold police officers accountable when there has been the killing of an unarmed black man in the hands of the police. This current controversy, while provocative and wherever you stand on this so-called debate, I think it's really important to remember that that is what is underlying these actions of taking a knee. And it's a reminder, really, that the lived experience of the legal system and the criminal justice system in our country has not been the same for all communities. That's a photo. All of us have seen it before, the iconic photo of John Lewis and 600 other protesters and demonstrators marching for voting rights on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. They were protesting Jim Crow laws and second-class citizenship of African-American citizens of the United States. This was taken at a moment where they were marching, leaving Selma, right at the foot of the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and were met by 150 Alabama state troopers, sheriff's deputies, and others who had ordered the demonstrators to disperse. And about a minute after they had received this 2-minute warning, the troops advanced. They were wielding clubs and bullwhips and tear gas. And now Congressman John Lewis's skull was fractured. He was one of 58 people treated at the hospital in what has now become known to all of us as Bloody Sunday. We have to remember that this nation was founded on unfair laws. It was founded on slavery. It was followed by Jim Crow laws. The country's history really is a history of the struggle to meet and correct those unfair laws. We all know slavery was the law of the land, Jim Crow was the law of the land, and all of it was legal, but it was not right. The country's history of struggle to right these wrongs are not just something that we look at in black and white photos, but actually part of our modern day, current day struggle around civil rights. We know that in the not so far past, we've had crack cocaine sentencing disparities laws, inequalities that have been enshrined into law, where we had 100-to-1 powder cocaine disparity ratio. We have state criminal justice reforms being enacted in states around the country, in red states and in blue states, where people are animated to correct the wrongs of our criminal justice system, whether it's motivated by cost, racial unfairness, by faith. But where the laws are unfair, the notion or theory of this country is that they must be changed, because it undermines the very legitimacy of our democracy and of the rule of law to have laws on the books that are unfair or even perceived to be unfair. Our democracy and public safety suffer when laws are unfairly enforced as well. and meaningful progress toward building a sense of trust between law enforcement and the communities that they protect really requires reckoning with the history of policing, with what that history and lived experience has meant for African Americans and other communities of color, including now new immigrant communities in our midst. We know now that there's a lot of folks in law enforcement that are actually seeking to reckon with us in real ways, where they're acknowledging, like Chief Dekmar did in LaGrange, Georgia earlier this year, where he apologized for a lynching that took place 75 years ago after a black man was snatched from a jail by a white mob, taken out and killed, and the police never investigated that. That is just one of many, many stories. You may remember that the head of the IACP, the International Association of Chiefs of Police, Terry Cunningham, apologized at the National Convention last year for the wrongs that law enforcement engaged in the past. But I think that there's a couple of things worth remembering. And that's that while we think about this history, we are reminded that this discrepancy in treatment has not always come in the form of extrajudicial or extra-legal violence. Unjust laws and unfair enforcement of laws create systemic roadblocks to achieving equality. Public safety is built on public faith and trust. And public trust is grounded in the idea that the laws that govern us and the systems that enforce them operate fairly. This photo was taken of a woman who was demonstrating in the aftermath of the unrest in Baton Rouge after the Alton Sterling killing just a couple of years ago. Decades of research and practice show that people are more likely to obey the law when they believe that those who are enforcing it have the right, and I would say even beyond the right, the legitimacy or the authority to tell them what to do. The public confers this legitimacy only on those who they believe are acting in procedurally just ways. But when the laws are unjust, or when they disproportionately and unfairly impact only certain communities or are enforced unfairly, the bonds of that community trust and legitimacy are broken. That's a photo taken on April 25th, 2015. A man running from the line of charging police in riot gear in the aftermath of Freddie Gray's death in a couple of awful nights of violence and protest in Baltimore. When I was at the Justice Department, we conducted an investigation into the Baltimore Police Department of systemic violations of constitutional rights. And in Baltimore, we saw how Baltimore's unique version of zero-tolerance street enforcement strategy really became a quest to produce numbers. Pedestrian stops in particular, regardless of their very limited impact on actually solving crime and their deep corrosive damage to community relationships. The city's African American residents bore the brunt of this activity. BPD made roughly 44% of its stops in two small, predominantly African American districts that contain only 11% of the city's population. Officers routinely arrested people for loitering and trespassing if they could not provide a valid reason for being on the sidewalk or standing near a public housing development. And in one instance, a shift commander emailed a template for describing such trespassing arrests. The template actually provided blank fields to be filled in with details, except that it had the words "black suspect" pre-filled for the suspect description. In Ferguson, Missouri, where we conducted an investigation into policing practices, aside from the terrible emails sent by local officials using blatantly and explicitly racist terms for African American residents and then President Obama and the like, the city was also using policing as a means to generate revenue to fund its local court system, routinely issuing citations as excessive fines and fees for minor violations. Fines like $302 for jaywalking, $427 for disturbing the peace, and $531 for allowing high grass and weeds to grow on your lawn. The municipal court was open for just a few hours every week, frustrating citizens' attempts to try to pay those fines, resulting in threats of incarceration and at times incarceration, where the corrosion of community police trust had been broken long before the shooting of Michael Brown in August of 2014. And then you have Chief Magnus, Chris Magnus, who was then chief of Richmond, California at the height of the movement for Black Lives that was pushing the country to reckon with some of the history around unfair laws and unfair enforcement. Sometimes right now it feels like we are in an incredibly polarized time where the conversation between race and policing and criminal justice and communities feels like an us versus them conversation. And in a lot of ways, and I think we have to acknowledge it, and the former Attorney General Eric Holder spoke to this, but we are in a time where this Justice Department is kind of producing and reinforcing that kind of us versus them, engaging, putting out a kind of dichotomy between what reform of policing and what the process of rebuilding community police trust can look like on the one hand, and saying that that kind of process hurts and hampers the fight for public safety and crime fighting, really pitting public safety against civil rights and civil liberties. But chiefs all over the country are not yielding to what's coming out of Washington, D.C. right now, and policing is inherently local. And they understand that their officers on the street need the trust of the community that they serve and the legitimacy in order to co-create public safety in those communities. It's too late to wait till a critical incident happens where a city can then go into mass unrest. And community leaders are not yielding either. And this is why the local organizing and the work and the collaborative work and cooperative work with law enforcement is so important at this time, to cut through that noise, to get people out of their corners, and to have the hard conversations that need to happen. It's not a conservative issue, it's not a liberal issue. This truly is about public safety in our communities. This is hard work, but this is the work ahead. We have to do it because without fair laws and fair enforcement of laws, there is no justice. And the reality is, and I'll quote my dear friend Ron Davis, but many others who have said this too, public safety is not just the absence of crime, but the presence of justice. And that's how we'll move forward. Thank you.
So, ladies and gentlemen, I need to apologize. I've been giving the wrong Wi-Fi password. So it is not your incompetence, it is my incompetence that has been frustrating you all. It is JJAY events. And if that's wrong, I'll come out in 10 minutes and tell you again. JJAY events, all lowercase. So embarrassingly, I apologize. So I want you to welcome the next speaker to the stage. He is the president of the Vera Institute of Justice, which is leading on ensuring that criminal justice strategies are driven by data and evidence. Please welcome Nick Turner.
So Ed Chung, that guy, the one who gave you the wrong Wi-Fi password, said that I had to do a TED Talk. And at first I was like, what? I don't want to do a TED Talk. But then I remembered Brian Stevenson did a TED Talk, and he raised like $1 million for his organization. So I said, sure, I'll do that. But then he told me that I had to do my TED Talk on data and evidence. And so I decided that I wouldn't do my TED Talk, but instead I would stand here behind this protective podium. So back in the 1990s, when I first became interested in criminal justice policy, it was called, or I called it then, a fact-free zone. Evidence didn't matter, and facts didn't matter. There was no evidence behind the ban on Pell Grants for education in prison. There was no evidence or data or conversations about effectiveness behind parole abolition, 3 strikes, you're out, and truth in sentencing. This is the kind of thing that there was behind those arguments. Or this. Well, not really that. That's NWA. You understand. I always like to figure out how I can get a little bit of my, old school hip hop into my presentations. But the equation of black skin, male black skin with criminality was very much at the root of what we saw. More than 20 years later, we're in a different place. Demagoguery is resurgent, to be sure. Cities of carnage, illegal alien rapists crossing the border from Mexico, rising crime rates nationally, homicide going through the roof. These are the things that we're told. But these things also have less power, and it's clear to me in the time that I've spent running Vera that evidence and data and effectiveness are resurgent. They are a full-fledged component, principle of this new gospel of smart on crime. Last week, I was in Houston, and I was with a group of educators and correctional leaders from 27 states who were gathered there to share lessons about their efforts to run college programs in prison as part of the Second Chance Pell program. People referenced the RAND meta-analysis of these programs. 43% reduction in recidivism, evidence of increased employment, evidence of increased income, the positive cost benefit. It was a remarkable thing to be in that room where every person, it seemed, could recite these statistics and genuflect to their power. Evidence we see now can drive change on a massive scale. Data can also be revelatory. It provides insight, it frames problems, and it tells us what we should be thinking about. Now, for years, every single one of us in this room has carried with us a belief that mass incarceration most profoundly affects big cities. Million-dollar blocks, South Central, Lawndale, Harlem, Mott Haven, all of them decimated. And for good reason, and it wasn't wrong and it isn't wrong. That's been the story of mass incarceration for the last few decades. But wait, I want you to look at this slide we have up right now. It may be a little bit hard to make out, but you can see around 2010 that the incarceration rate in big cities and in big suburbs started to decline. This is a slide for pretrial incarceration, but we see the very same patterns in overall jail incarceration and prison incarceration, while the rates of incarceration have continued to grow in rural areas and small cities. Let's use Lackawanna County as an example. This is in the northeast corner of Pennsylvania. It's a county of around 200,000 people. It's 92% white. And you can see it, it's the red stripe angling up, and compare it with the reduction of incarceration in New York City. Lackawanna is an example of what's happening in rural counties and small and medium-sized counties all over the country. And who knew? No one, it turns out, until we assembled the data and analyzed it. And what that data shows us, the insight it gives us, the problem it tells us that we need to solve is that if we really want to cut 50, in addition to focusing on our big cities, which are well underway, we need to focus on all of those places in flyover country, something we've never done before. So I like data. No surprise, I'm the head of the Vera Institute of Justice. Of course I do. But I have to confess that I have concerns about it too. First, I worry that we can be too fanatical sometimes. Oftentimes we're almost fetishistic, requiring degrees of proof and certainty such that it risks paralysis and a failure to move and to act, such that we become too conservative and risk-averse in the absence of the quantum of data that we feel we must have, such that daring to innovate, to try something new, which this sector desperately needs, is overpowered. Our justice system and its impact on millions and millions and millions of people requires absolute urgency. And so, if at times we act in the name of reform with less data and evidence than makes us comfortable, I think that's okay. I think it's important. Second, my fellow justice nerds, we cannot be just book smart. We have to be people smart. We have to have EQ. Daryl Atkinson spoke about this earlier this morning. Having EQ is not a thing you learn at Yale, let me tell you. Adherents of Smart on Crime must pay attention to the power of values and to the power of human narrative. What do I mean by values? This, that people, voters, legislators, advocates, commissioners act because they believe, because of what defines them, their values, their beliefs. People act because they have convictions, because they believe in restoration rather than retribution, or because they believe in human dignity rather than human diminishment. This work is as much about heart as it is about head. Narrative speaks to the heart. Narrative builds empathy. Darryl reminded us of this when he talked about our brothers and our sisters and our mothers and fathers and to get beyond the numbers. So we need a marriage of smart on crime, data and evidence of effectiveness, but we also need narratives of people and human empathy. And I hope we have a little less in this marriage of Willie Horton, and we have more of this.
We're so lucky to spend Mother's Day together, but there are hundreds of thousands of kids whose moms are incarcerated this Mother's Day.
So we wanted some kids to share letters that they wrote to their moms. Dear Mom, hi Mom, I miss you very much.
I know I don't write you a lot, but this letter right here is actually pretty special.
Your second Mother's Day away, I took to Facebook and posted, I love my mother.
But most of all, I miss your love. I miss your hugs.
Every Mother's Day, I listen to all of our favorite songs.
I think about you all the time. At night, when I'm getting ready to go to bed, it makes me think of the most amazing mom that I have.
I miss playing with you and sleeping with you at night.
I miss your smile, and I miss how you always used to say funny things on Facebook and post that. I miss how you used to I can't do it.
An outspoken voice for just and proportional responses to crime, please welcome the co-chair of Law Enforcement Leaders to Reduce Crime and Incarceration, former chief of the New Orleans Police Department, Dr. Ronald SERPAS.
Good morning, how are you? First off, I'm from New Orleans. That means you're probably not going to get my accent. Just imagine that I'm from the Northeast and it'll all work fine. It's great to be here this morning, and I want to thank Carol and John Jay and everyone for helping us come together to talk about Smart on Crime. Today I don't talk to you as a former police chief in New Orleans, the former police chief in Nashville, Tennessee, or even the former chief of the Washington State Patrol, or as a professor from Loyola University, New Orleans. Today I speak to you as the founding co-chair of Law Enforcement Leaders to Reduce Crime and Incarceration. It's a partnership sponsored with the Brennan Center, and I know Nicole Fortier is here, who makes me look a whole lot smarter than I am, and I wanted to thank her for all the work that she's doing, and Nini Mai and everyone back at the Brennan Center. When we think about just and proportional policing response to crime to eliminate disparities, the Law Enforcement Leaders Group has a few principles that we really strongly believe actually speak to every one of these points. The first one is we have to find alternatives to arrest for our officers. The second we have to do is look at reclassifying some of these crimes and the harsh penalties associated with crimes with legislation passed in the 90s and 80s to try to fight crime. The third thing is this whole question of mandatory minimum sentences and whether that makes any difference and whether or not there's any social science to support it makes a difference. And the fourth is reinvesting and continually focusing our efforts and attention on community policing, justice and legitimacy, and how do we get there from here. So when we think about this just and proportional response to crime, I really think that the alternatives to arrest is something we should spend a little time on. In the United States of America, with nearly 800,000 police officers and 18,000 police departments, we see police officers as the tip of the spear of the actions directed to them by legislative bodies. And in this last 2 years, the things that we have learned and continue to see over and over again is it's the alternatives to arrest that makes things proportional and makes them just. And surprisingly, and even to me, who with my co-chair and our leadership group, who were at the front line of fighting crime in the 90s and the 2000s, we were CompStat warriors. We were the people who looked at crime as a matter of metrics of arrest, stops, traffic stops, business checks. And we are the ones, with so many others, who realized it's not a shock that half the people in our prisons and jails suffer from mental health diagnosed issues. It's not a surprise that the local police officer is in fact spending a tremendous amount of time in a cycle of a life sentence given out 2 days at a time. And what does that mean? A Nashville police officer said this on television about 10 years ago, and it struck me to my shoes. This officer was being asked by a local media person, how do you go to work every day in this part of the neighborhood and arrest these same people over and over again? And he said, because I don't have any alternatives. He says, in fact, I don't like, as a police officer, that I'm giving this person a life sentence 2 days at a time. I arrest them on Monday. They've committed some criminal infraction, usually very minor. The property owner has said, hey, I want this thing off my street. They don't care about the complexity issues and all the things going on behind the scenes. The officer brings the person to a jail. At that jail, they're being treated by cops and jailers, not doctors and nurses. They sober up. They go back out on the street. They have no further support mechanism that they can use or have the ability to choose to use, and they create the same infraction again on Thursday. And the cycle repeats itself, and it repeats itself. Over this last year, through some funding by the Department of Justice and the International Association of Chiefs of Police, I've had an opportunity to visit 12 of the 15 site visits for the 21st Century Policing President Obama's plan. And let me share with you the great news. All the sites I've visited, you might want to study yourself. All the sites I visited, the officers were clamoring for alternatives to arrest. The officers in Tucson, Arizona, use alternatives to arrest every single opportunity they have. The officers in Lowell, Massachusetts, the South Dakota Highway Patrol, Hennepin County. Everywhere we've been, we see police officers themselves, almost, if you will, saying to the elected leaders, give us an alternative. And if you do, there's a very good chance we're going to use it. And as we look around the country, we see it. You look at the LEAD program in Seattle. Baltimore is replicating the LEAD program. You look at the opportunities where police chiefs of the 90s and 2000s are now advocating for reducing arrests. While chief in New Orleans from May of 2010 to August of 2014, New Orleans is a city well known for a tremendous problem with death and destruction through homicide and shootings. And we were able to see a dramatic reversal in the numbers of deaths and shootings in a city while we were simultaneously reducing arrests by 40%. 40%. That wasn't good weather or luck. That was a directed strategy. And guess who accepted the strategy? The police officers. When we told them it was okay not to arrest everybody with a little bag of weed in their pocket, they said, oh, okay, we can do something different. When we told them we want to adapt and adjust to smart on crime policies like group violence reduction or cure violence and all these other alternatives to arrest, the officers were on board. And I think that's the key to just and proportional response to eliminate or reduce the amount of disparate impact. Give the officers alternatives. Make sure that if they're not using the alternatives, they're being trained, they're being taught, and they're learning that alternatives to arrest can make the difference. Now, are there people in the communities that we all live in that need to be separated from us? Of course. But the problem is, watching my young daughter, who's a prosecutor in Orleans Parish, one of the busiest courts in the country, watching my two son-in-laws who are still police officers, I don't know what the girls were thinking, but they both picked a cop, you tell me. And I get to listen to them at night, and I get to listen to the point of view of a young prosecutor who says, I don't have enough time in the day to deal with these very violent criminal acts because we have all these other things that are coming in front of us. And I hear my two son-in-laws, one's a homicide detective in New Orleans and one is an undercover narcotics detective in the next county. And I hear them say, if we could just focus on these really, truly dangerous, violent people, we could make a bigger difference. And at the end of this analysis, there's one commonality. We have limited prisons, we have limited prosecutors, and we have limited police. And with 2.3 million people in jails and prisons in this country, and pretty much universally everybody accepts that at least half of them have a diagnosed mental health condition, even a young cop who's buying drugs, even a young leader who's investigating homicides, and even a young prosecutor understand and recognize we don't have the time to focus on the truly dangerous people that we should be afraid of, because our laws, our practices, and our systems are making us focus on the people that we are angry at. So in our jails and prisons, we have people that we're mad at. You didn't pay this bill. You didn't pay your ticket on this traffic citation. You didn't do this. You didn't do that. And we only have so many beds. Wouldn't we rather see the people who have to be segmented from the community be those ones that we are afraid of? The ones who produce the violent crime that has life-lasting impact on families and communities? So really, this whole idea of just and proportional responses in the criminal justice system by the police is we've got to keep finding alternatives to arrest. We have to use those as a way to give people the treatment that we know can help them. We have to use that in a way to keep the very precious and valuable limited numbers of prisons, prosecutors, and police focused with a narrow laser attention on the dangerous people. I'm proud to have been a chief in the 90s and the 2000s and halfway through 2014. And I've seen a lot of things that have caused me to stay awake at night and wonder, how do we get to where we are? But all of that pales in comparison. All of that pales in comparison to a trip I took to Tucson, Arizona, and sat and rode in a car with police officers who were excited not to show me the new whiz-bang gadget they had in the car, who weren't excited to show me the new video camera, who weren't excited to show us the new whatever. They drove us as fast as their cars could go to the crisis response center. And they said to us, Chief, they still call me Chief whether I like it or not, they said, Chief, dig this. We got a guy we just had a problem with in downtown, and we brought him here, we waived the criminal charge, and in 8 minutes, we were back out on the street again looking for dangerous people. Now think about that. In 8 minutes, they brought someone who didn't need a jail bed. They brought someone who didn't need to be prosecuted. They brought someone who needed help from mental health professionals, not jailers and cops. Thank you very much.
Now to discuss the fourth Smart on Crime principle, please welcome three leading people on comprehensive investments, including prevention and reentry, from the Anti-Recidivism Coalition, Scott Budnick and Louie, CHAGOLLA, and from the Laura and John Arnold Foundation, Amy Solomon.
I respect that.
We've heard this morning about principles of fair and just and smart, and if we don't have services, programs, and strategies and people in the community to make sure there are comprehensive prevention services and rehabilitation and reentry services, that will be for naught. And so we want to spend a little bit of time talking about that today. There's going to be panels throughout the 2 days that really point to promising models. And here we want to get at some of the human story and bring some of these issues to life. And we have two very special people who we're going to talk to, Scott and Louie. And I'm going to start with Scott here. And Scott, some of you may know, is some hotshot LA movie producer. And I want to know why he got into this world. What moved you so much to get into this world? What compelled you to focus on reentry and anti-recidivism?
I think it's, I started with children, right? I produced a movie called Old School, and a producer on that film brought me down to the local juvenile hall, and I sat at a table with 12 kids facing life. And like, how do you sit with 12 kids facing life sentences? The kid sitting right next to me, his name was David. I asked him, why is he there? And he said, he just got sentenced yesterday to 300 to life, and he was 15. And when I dissected the case, he wasn't the shooter. Victim was shot in the rear end by someone else, but just for being an aider and abetter, 300 to life. basically writing them off. Like, you can't change. You are this act. You will die in prison as this act. And that just was unacceptable to me. So I promised those kids, maybe it was a mistake, maybe it wasn't, but I promised those kids at that table that no matter how much time they get or whether they're coming home, I'm there for them till the wheels fall off, till I'm no longer around, and I'll be with them throughout the whole time. And once I said that, I had to honor that promise. And I started teaching that creative writing class, and then had hundreds, then thousands of folks we followed. And then after a while, just turned it into the Anti-Recidivism Coalition, because we then had 150 members who had gotten out of incarceration. We had helped pass a bill in Sacramento to help juveniles who were sentenced to life without parole. And I just, to me, is like walking into ARC every day and being surrounded by people like Louie and folks that have come out of incarceration and have really endured struggle and are unbelievable human beings is so much better than being stuck in Hollywood with some real criminals. And so it's hands down the best decision of my life. And I feel like I work for them. Like, the whole organization is about empowering their voices, bringing them as leaders, and I can't wait to step down and actually have someone that's system impacted running the organization, and everyone in the organization system impacted. So I love it.
What are you providing for them when they get out?
Two halves of the organization. One is we're a community, 500 members now, formerly incarcerated, support system, love, family, but all the resources. We have 2 housing programs based at the community colleges where we house 60 people, soon to be 100 people, job training with real living wage careers in different things, partnering with organizations that do computer coding. We have a union training program where we place people into guaranteed union jobs once they go through the training, not a certificate, not a job, like a career for life, therapy, healing, mentorship. And then the other half of the organization is actually the policy side, where those that did do time are going up to Sacramento and sitting with the governor, which happened 3 times this year, sitting with senators, assembly members, telling their stories, showing their leadership. And because of this and because of their advocacy, 7 bills are now sitting on the governor's desk, including, Jody, a bill to completely end life without parole sentences for juveniles in California that if we're lucky, will be signed tomorrow when we're at this conference. So let's pray.
Thanks, Scott. And Louie here is a member of ARC, and he's also a full-time college student. And he's very brave to be here. This is your first trip to New York, right?
Yes, it is.
We got a big crew today, but I told him people want to hear from him. So Louie, tell us a little bit about your story. Tell us about what was helpful to you on your way out. You have become part of the solution, and tell us what was helpful in getting there.
All right, so good morning, everyone, or almost a good afternoon, but my name is Louie. I'm 22 years old, turned 23 in 2 weeks. I got out 3 years ago, 2014, July 18th, and I pretty much served a time of 3 years in CYA, which is the California Youth Authority, and it's pretty much a lower grade level of another prison for juveniles. So I think what I believe is the oldest you can be there is 25, and then I've seen juveniles ranging from the ages of 12 and 13. So you got juveniles with grown men in there. I grew up in South Central Los Angeles. I ended up getting heavily into like drugs. I'm an ex-gang member as well now. No longer active as well. Pretty much gave all that up as soon as I came out. As soon as I came out, I reached out to Scott, and he kind of just started giving me the ideas that he was gonna do, the housing. So I'm actually living at one of the housings that he said. I've been there ever since. When I came out, I actually went and got an intern job over at ARC as well, a 3-month internship, and that's something that they're doing continuously now, every 3 months. Once I moved from there, and I was staying over there, I became a full-time student at Los Angeles Mission College in Silmar, California. And once I became there, maybe after my 2nd semester being in school, I ended up getting my own job there, working for the Student Outreach and Recruitment Office. And what I do there is go out to the local community in my area and I talk to all the local high school students, ranging from 9th graders all the way to even the seniors, kind of just giving them another option or giving them a variety of options of what they can do while they're in school or while they're about to transition out and go into college or university. And not only that, I also go and talk to some of the elementary school students and some of even the middle school students sometimes when I have a chance, like whenever there's like career fairs or college fairs or anything like that.
This, I don't know if you can answer this. This is hard, but why did you seek out Scott? What was it that made you think this would be helpful for me?
What made me seek out Scott was the idea that he had of helping those that didn't have that opportunity, or he actually realized too that when we come out, there aren't very many opportunities for us, and there aren't a lot of obstacles that we have to jump through in order for me or for people like me to get jobs out there in the world. Once people see, or like employers see that box check, yes, I have been convicted of a felony before, it's super hard to try to land a job. Before I landed my job at school, it took me maybe 3 months to finally do that. So seeking out Scott was like the best thing. Like I'm here now in New York in front of all these beautiful people speaking right now. I'm a city boy, so I don't even know what it's like to be outside of LA, like I said. So.
Now you do. You talked about job, how hard it is to get a job. Tell us what you want to do when you're done with school. You're halfway through, right?
Yeah, I'm halfway through. So I should be finishing up hopefully within the spring or fall of next year. And I should be finishing with my liberal studies degree in AA. And then my main focus is to join in the fire service, which is wildland firefighting, which I have been doing for the last 4 years. So that's pretty much my goal, is to go ahead and get a full-time position in the wildland service.
So you've got the skills, the motivation, the heart to really contribute there, and there's such a huge need. Scott, are there barriers in California to doing that kind of work for people with records?
Yeah, there are, but we have a governor who has 1.5 years left and still hasn't felt like he's done enough. And so the governor has now asked CalFire, which is dealing with all the wildfires that are raging in California right now. They've never hired anyone formerly incarcerated, and now they're opening up a camp where they're going to hire 80 people straight out of prison in juvenile fire camps, give them full-time CalFire careers, and integrate them with all their other crews. And so that's going to happen next year, and that's going to be the first time that's ever happened in California. And we've been including Louie in the planning process because we want to have him to help him run it. Who better than to help people coming out of incarceration than Louie?
Scott, I have another question for you. We've been talking about evidence, data, smart, research-driven. How does that come into play in the ARC program model, or what you're seeing with the reentry efforts?
I mean, I feel like what we do really well is just we care deeply. And I think people understand that we and everyone that works with us, I mean, most of our staff are formerly incarcerated and care deeply. I just went through, our whole staff just went through motivational interviewing training. And so I did as well. So I did 2 days of MI. And I thought, like, I was pretty good at this stuff. And I sat in that training, I'm like, I don't really know anything. And then I'm like, is this shit really gonna work? So I went up to Pelican Bay Prison, and I'm like, okay, I'm gonna try this MI thing out, because this sounds a little hokey, but let's see if it works. And I actually pulled out a kid from the SHU who had been in solitary confinement for about 5 years, was now about 25 years old. And they put him in a stand-up cage, so I had to talk to him through this cage. We had a little interview room, but we couldn't sit face to face. So I'm like, this is gonna be an interesting place to try motivational interviewing. I really realized on that day that I was somewhat effective for the last 14 years. This day I was really effective. We got down to like such deep stuff, just letting him talk. Like, I've always been a good listener, but just the tactics I learned. So I was definitely a skeptic going in, and this kid decided on that day to make all the changes he needed to make to turn his life around. And because of it, in 2 weeks, he's going to be getting out of the SHU.
Louie, you're clearly passionate about working with youth and talking with youth and trying to keep them out of the system that you spent time in. Can you talk about what this conference, the kinds of issues we're talking about, what that has to do with youth, how youth can play a role moving forward, how they can be involved in the solution the way that you are?
One thing I found very useful is surrounding myself by those who have the same mindset, and even surrounding myself by those who are even greater or in higher positions as well, because it just makes me want to strive that much harder to be that much better and to continue to pursue greatness. I think these juveniles that are coming out nowadays just need that support, someone to be there even when they're like, oh man, I don't want to talk to you right now. Like someone who's just gonna be there like, okay, I'll be here when you need it. Resources, like you said, all that therapy sometimes for those, because some people have gone through a lot more trauma maybe than what I have, maybe, you know, life experiences. So some of those things might actually be very beneficial to them. Like me, like I said, also, school was another thing that I was very passionate about doing. I ended up graduating from high school in juvenile hall because I dropped out my first 2 months of senior year, and then I ended up pursuing that as well. So education is another thing that I believe is thing for them to stay focused on.
Our clock is at 0. What we're going to do now is bring up the other panelists so we can have questions from the audience. But I just want to say you two are both extraordinary and such great role models for people in this country, and I want to thank you. Okay, so we have a few minutes. We have the whole panel back here, and we are open for Q&A. If everyone who wants to speak, we've got mics roaming, and if you can very briefly identify yourself and your organization and ask a brief question, that would be great.
So I'm going to exercise some privilege here. My name is Carol Mason. Hey, Scott. So you all were mentioning this youth who was in SHU, and for those of you who, it sounds like a pretty word, it's segregated housing unit, for those of you who don't know what a SHU is. We put out some really strong guidelines when we were at the Department of Justice about reducing segregated housing, and juveniles are not supposed to be in segregated housing at all. So what's happening on that issue in California and other places where, and the National Juvenile Defenders Association also put out some interesting guidelines on this as well?
Thanks, Carol, for what you guys did. It's helped so much. So this young person that I was talking about had left the juvenile system and had gone into the adult system as a juvenile. So he was at Pelican Bay State Prison, and at Pelican Bay, this is where we've held people in California in solitary confinement for as long as 37 years. Because of some litigation, because of an inmate hunger strike, because of pressure from federal governments and really around the world, California, under Governor Jerry Brown and Corrections Secretary Scott Kernan, ended the practice of indeterminate solitary confinement. So those folks who had been in the SHU for 20, 30, 35, almost 40 years were released onto the general population yard. And one incredible story is a guy by the name of Jack Morris, who I had met back in the SHU. He came into the system when he was a juvenile, spent 40 years incarcerated, and 37 of those years was in the SHU. He spent 37 years, 1 hour a day in a concrete rec yard by himself, the other 23 hours a day in his cell. 37 years. Got out because of this positive change, and showed up onto the yard where we have a college program at Ironwood State Prison, 400 men on this yard in college. And I happened to be there on the first day, and Jack said, I want to get involved. I said, well, Jack, luckily for you, we have a math tutor job open, and I know you got 2 college degrees in solitary confinement, so do you want to be a math tutor? So Jack, at 60 plus years old, became the math tutor at Ironwood, and helped out in education, helped out in the Last Mile program, which is at Ironwood, the computer coding program. And Jack went to his 13th parole board hearing. His first 12 were in SHU. His 13th, his first one out, he was out and was found suitable, and the governor released him 3 weeks ago. And if you call ARC, Jack is our receptionist. And our lead mentor.
Hi, this question's for Chief SERPAS. I'm with the Jackson County, Missouri Prosecutor's Office. When you're talking about alternatives to arrest for police officers, and that the patrol guys, the guys on the street, want that and want to use that, have you encountered, I guess, more resistance from the brass? And if so, like, how have you convinced them that this is the way to go? And how do you roll that out?
I think that many of us who grew up in the quote-unquote CompStat era have since learned that those types of alternatives do several things. It lets you focus on the people who are truly dangerous. It lets you have the officers more available time to do other creative things that you might like to do. So I think that there's been a sea change at many forward-leaning police chiefs around the country, and there's thousands of them, who recognize there's a better way to do this. It's a lot safer for the people that you're encountering. It's safer for the officers. Essentially, it's kind of like reducing mass incarceration. It's a win-win from either side of the political spectrum. Either you're for reducing mass incarceration because it costs too much, or you're for reducing mass incarceration for the social justice question. Great. They both have a place to stand. And I think more officers, particularly the younger ones, the ones who come up and hopefully a little better educated and a little more interested in altruistic service, they get that message very quickly.
I'm back. Scott, I was at your TEDx at Ironwood where you gave those men that live there a voice. Incredible, incredible day. We'll never forget it. Lou, I just got to say, Louie, sorry. You're doing way more than just starting your life over. You're giving those men that are still there the idea and vision that you can make it as well. We have one of the only college programs in the country that's not just a degree-granting program, but it's run and staffed by formerly incarcerated people. 60% of our team lived in those seats and now run it. The message that we deliver back to those prisons, we're now in 6 sites in New York, is a very clear one, that if I can do it, you can do it. And there's also a healing component to you standing in front of 200 people and telling your story. Incredibly brave, but that's as good for you as it is for us to hear that story. So kudos to you, keep doing the good work, and thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Kenyatta Leal. I'm with the Last Mile program out of San Quentin. So congratulations, Louie, and all your great work. My question to you is, a lot of people don't realize how when somebody is incarcerated, how that impacts the family. The families end up doing time with you. I served 19 years myself. I know how that feels. So my question to you is, how are things with your family? Have you been able to, rebuild those bonds with them? I mean, what's going on with that?
Yeah, to answer that, yeah, it was tough. When I got out, my mom was incarcerated. I have 9 or 8 younger brothers and sisters. 2 of them were with my aunt, and the other 5 or 6 were in foster care because they were removed from their father's home. So I came out to that my first month. My mom came out, and then my brothers were relocated, and then within that year, I helped my mom go to court and fight for my brothers and sisters and bring them back home. So we actually got that. So I was able to actually come out to some little chaos and help put the pieces back together. And now I actually say I think I have a pretty good, strong relationship with my family. I don't always communicate with them as much as I should, but because also, like you said, I'm always working as well too. I'm pretty busy sometimes, but when I go out there, I spend maybe a week sometimes with them. I just do the best I can and try to make those great memories and put everything else in the past.
Speak to these issues at all, Nick?
Oh, I can always speak. Yes. So, I actually do want to address the question that Carol asked about the guidance that the Department of Justice put out around restrictive housing, because and what's happening. I mean, at Vera, we're actually working with 10 states right now to help them reduce their overuse of restrictive housing. And it illustrates a lot of the themes that have come up here. I mean, one of which is that data can be king and powerful. You know, one of the things that we do in every one of these places is go in and grab all of their data and ask these states what they think they're doing, how they think they're using solitary confinement, and then of course it turns out that when we do the analysis, it's totally different than what it is they think they're doing. But it also points out another thing, which is around someone said earlier that you can have a great strategy, but culture eats strategy every day, and that's what a lot of these corrections administrators are up against, is figuring out how, after decades of the same practice of relying on restrictive housing for discipline, even to provide safety for vulnerable populations, to start to do different things. And they're struggling with two things. One is that there's a very little sort of evidence base of what else might be more effective, because it's not a well-studied area, but also they have to figure out how to work with the corrections unions and with their staffs, who are convinced, with no evidence, that restrictive housing is the thing that keeps them safe. And so we're learning, actually, that when they do start to invent and try new things and to innovate and to figure out how to create a disciplinary ladder or a set of alternatives, that safety is being produced. So we monitor that and we study it, and then we can show the staff that, in fact, there are fewer incidents and so on. But it's the wheels of change operate really slowly in that context. Data is a really important thing to give insight, but being able to move the way people who are operating in that system, what they believe, and to help them figure out how they need to change is a really critical piece of it as well.
Thanks. I think Scott wants to jump in on the culture issue.
Yeah, I think the culture thing that you mentioned and the other gentleman mentioned is so key. That's what we're up against all the time inside, and our corrections secretary in California is like very progressive, and he heard a bunch of our ex-lifers who had done life sentences in prison that were now out speak, and he was blown away by them, and he goes, if I got all of my captains from every yard of all 35 prisons, that's like 300 captains, if I got them all in a room for training in Sacramento, would your ex-lifers come train them? And so, which was crazy. So we ended up sending 7 people that spent 20, 30 years in prison who are now out, very successful, up to Sacramento with a room full of captains who run the yards in the prisons, and who are if you have a bad captain, then there's no rehabilitation in that yard, and everyone is going to be treated like an animal. If you have a good captain, then they'll ask for programs, they'll ask for education, and great things can happen. And at that session, it was supposed to be an hour and a half, and all the captains started with their arms crossed, with kind of this look of why the hell do I have to listen to these inmates? And then as it started coming, and as these guys started telling stories about, I had this interaction with this officer, and he asked me how my day was, and then we developed a rapport, and he started mentoring me, and then they started sitting up, and then they started listening, and then they started leaning forward, and in the end, 50 hands shot up, and we had a question and answer session for like 2 hours. And in that moment, and since that moment, everything that we've tried to do on every yard at every prison is 1,000 times easier. So the point I'm making is, these folks in these correctional systems, they just see the bad stories. They see the person that gets out and comes back. They see their staff assaulted. They see the worst of the worst, and that's all they're conditioned by. You have incredible stories like Kenyatta, like Louie, and thousands of others that if they are brought in to help change culture, culture will change. So, just want to make that point.
Thank you. We have a question back there.
Daryl Harris from Total Life Christian Ministries in Detroit, Michigan. My question really goes towards, I believe it's Mr. Turner. You mentioned about data and the importance of that data. And I believe that data interpreted and used to a restorative end is what's really powerful. Because sometimes data, when it's not, it feeds into policy. And instead of it being used to identify what is actually taking place, it can be used to stigmatize. It can be used to hold things and take things in another direction. When I heard the retired chief mention about the arrest and how that procedure happens, is there any way that data can play into changing policy to make it easier for officers to be able to look for ways to deal with things that are non-arrest? Because sometimes we can talk about it on the ground level, but because it's not impacting policy, you really don't get those opportunities and those doors to be open. And so some of this may be culture of police officers and how they identify with criminality, but oftentimes this is policy. And I work with a lot of officers in Detroit, and many of them say that. They look at it as, this is my job. This is what I am called to do, with the PERV rules and different things of that nature. So I just wondered if there was a way to talk about how data could impact policy to give more opportunities to officers to look for ways that they don't have to arrest in certain situations.
Can I actually just, there's one piece that I want to add in, because you've been talking about data and police officers, but I think a missing part of the conversation is you can have all the data you want that shows the inutility of a certain kind of practice. You also need politicians and mayors and city councils to actually be giving police departments other options besides arrest and incarceration as responses. I mean, when you think about all of the things that we have criminalized over the last 30, 40 years, school discipline, substance use disorders, homelessness, mental illness, issues that in a lot of other countries and contexts are not necessarily met solely with a criminal justice incarceration response. When you hear from police officers all the time that they don't necessarily think that there is a utility to constantly using jail as the kind of the largest mental health institutions in our communities, but you have to be able to use data, because data by itself isn't going to create political will for a different set of responses. And police officers are often just made to be the first responders for these social problems, and we've got to shift. That part of what's happening, I think, in states around the country is a shift in that paradigm of thinking about what are the options, what does public safety look like, what's the role of the community in actually helping to create other alternatives besides a criminalization model that has resulted in so many Black and brown folks just getting kind of institutionalized rather than really having these very serious social issues addressed through other means outside of the criminalization model. And I think it'd be great to hear from you, because you've got the culture piece on top of the political piece that often can be the rubber hits the road, but you've got to have politicians also in this mix.
Absolutely. I'm involved with a project with the Vera Institute, the Police Foundation, and others called CompStat 2.0. Because what we're trying to do is wrap our brains exactly around that. Having been a CompStat chief for a very long time, 14 years, we measured certain things that turned into consequences we didn't anticipate. So the political piece that VANITA brings out is so critically important, because in the 90s and into the early 2000s, the CompStat data was driving outcomes that were very politically palatable to a lot of people. Oh, crime's going down, things must be getting better. That's not the answer. The answer is, what does a CompStat 2.0 look like? It looks like measuring what matters. Are people receiving the service believing that it was just and legitimate? And as Professor Rosenboom pointed out so brilliantly, we need to treat our officers with justice and legitimacy practices by our supervisors, so that they're not just seeing it as, go do what I want you to do, not how I behave. But then you've also got to pay a lot of attention to Cynthia Loom. Where are we doing the surveys? Are we oversampling in the neighborhoods where there are stressed relationships, or are we just getting the global picture of the city looks good? Those are some new techniques to try to give back to the officers a different set of metrics, a different set of data points, not to dismiss that we do have to focus on murder, rape, robbery, assault, burglary, theft, auto theft. Of course we have to focus on those things, but in the early days of CompStat, that's all we focused on. And I see a dear friend of mine, a former chief, I won't call him out, but that's only about 4 to 5% of the weekly workload. I mean, you just don't have any, so this other 90% we were basically ignoring, maybe not by choice, but certainly by practice. So that's what we have to do is find those metrics that really, really matter. The younger generation is very susceptible to those metrics.
Yeah, if I can just jump on this, I would say, yes, absolutely, data can be used to change policy, and then absolutely that is just the beginning of it, as you've heard here, that you need broad political support, you need leadership support. In any complex organization that is going to change its behavior, you have to think about the inputs into that organization and then how they are governed and how they're evaluated. So who's being hired to effectuate that policy, the difference between someone who's been hired to work in a police agency where the only job is enforcement is going to look different than someone who is going to adopt a more guardian perspective. So that the hiring process and recruitment process looks different. How people are evaluated. Do you get credit for doing something different than just responding to everything that comes your way with an arrest? And then as Ron was saying, how does the organization monitor itself? What does it hold dear and say are the important outcomes, the important measures? So you have to think about these complex organizations. Data is the beginning of it. It can guide all of it. It can shape where you're going. But all of these other levers have to be pulled as well.
A 10-second statement. I've been a police chief in front of councils, in front of state legislatures. They're looking for the 30-second, Chief, is crime going down? Yes, okay, thank you very much, have a nice day. And we have to be careful how we sold that as the solution when in fact, like every environmental, like everything on the universe, you have to evolve. You have to evolve. And what we thought worked 10 years ago is not going to work 10 years from now, and what we're doing today is not going to be effective 10 years further. We have to be willing to move and change. And one of the reasons I enjoyed working with VANITA so much in the Department of Justice investigation of the NOPD is they helped us turn that corner a bit, put some pressure on the political process, which consent decrees do very effectively, to fund that type of thinking, to fund that type of research, to fund that type of training, because absent a consent decree, many cities like New Orleans and others that are broke just stop funding those things.
Question over here.
Hello, my name is Genevieve Citron. I'm from the Justice Programs Office at American University. My question is for all of you. These smart on crime policies that you've been discussing today focus a lot on the front end through law enforcement and community relations, and the back end with sentencing and reentry, but there seemed to be kind of a missing critical stage there, which is the courtroom, focusing on pretrial and trial stages. Earlier, former Attorney General spoke about prosecutorial discretion, but something that's been left out of the conversation all morning has been the role of defense and public defenders. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about both the role of kind of defense in these criminal justice policy conversations in addition to kind of the more standard courtroom role that they play.
Sure, I can start with that. That was John Rapping leading the clapping right there. So I think it's a really important point, and I think sometimes in these conversations, as you said, there's a focus on policing and sentencing. I actually think there is an inadequate focus on prosecutors and the role that prosecutors play, and then on the role of the really important role of defense counsel in being like really the real-time defense against not only constitutional abuses, but also detectors of trends and patterns within a community around policing issues, around prosecutorial abuses, around really like what's happening in the local criminal justice system. And in too many parts of the country, the defense function has been under-regarded, underfunded, maligned, and had been given vastly unequal resources compared to the prosecutorial function. And then we wonder why we see, such a high percentage of pleas taken in any given jurisdiction and the like. And I think the defense function and the role of it in the criminal justice system is one that needs to be much more kind of lifted up. I actually think there's a huge role for systemic reform that a lot of defense counsel play in really when you've got offices that have, for example, the ability to bring systemic challenges because they keep seeing abuses of the Fourth Amendment by a set of single police officers, or they're able to really identify and bring to core the importance of advocacy in bail reform so that you're not just incarcerated because you're too poor to pay. And so, there's a lot that needs to be done about the defense function. I think the unequal funding is one part of it. But I do think that the role that they play in holding back prosecutors and prosecutorial abuse is tremendously important. And what's been interesting recently is seeing that there have been more DA races around the country where more progressive DAs are getting elected, and there's even been former defense counsel getting elected as DAs, and it's going to be interesting to see whether that creates the kind of culture change in local criminal justice systems that one may expect. And I do need to give Rapping a shout out, because he and other folks in the defense community have really lifted up the importance of this issue, which too often does get left out of criminal justice reform conversations.
Real quick, Amy, look, if we talk about criminal justice reform only as the reform of American policing, it's not going to get any better. In the post-Ferguson world, a tremendous amount of attention has been focused on policing, rightly so. I'm a proud cop. Our family's been serving since 1914. We can get better, but that doesn't change the problems of the system. So I sometimes think we hear a lot of focus on police reform, which is required, necessary, but bail bond reform, pretrial diversion reform, judges operating essentially in rooms where they won't let the public in, and we want police to have video cameras because we want the public to see. There's so many other pieces that have to be dealt with, not just police reform.
Some of the other sessions dive in specifically to the issues that you raised, so I urge you to look closely at the agenda and attend those sessions. There's 9 minutes left. We're going to get at least 2 questions on the table in the air, and then we can take some piece of that one over here.
Daryl Atkinson, Forward Justice. Evidence-based practices have come a long way. We know a lot more than we used to, but it's still a lot that we don't know. And if we're only confined to what we currently know what works, that doesn't leave room for any experimentation, any innovation to do something new. So Nick, data guy, I'm curious, what do you think we're gonna have to do to break open this kind of lockbox where we can have more experimentation in the field so we can find out more things that work effectively?
First of all, he loves being called the data guy.
Don't ever do that again. I mean, Daryl, like what you said and then what I said back up at this podium, I think it's incredibly important for us not to get locked into what I would describe as a conservative way of thinking, which is that the only stuff we need to be doing is evidence-based in its most sort of rigorous form. It is hugely important for us to innovate and to take risks and for these systems to try to do things that are different, because we're basically operating in an environment where for 40 years, the clarion call of reform wasn't hitting the ears of people who were running these systems. And so now all of a sudden, I mean, imagine if you have been called upon after 40 years of not training, not eating well, not taking care of yourself, to then say, like, you've got to run a marathon and you have to do it today. It is hard to sort of, you don't have the muscle memory to do that, and it's going to take a while, and building a reform culture in agencies and in an innovation culture is hugely important. So I think people need to take risks, and that those of us in this room need to be committed to smart on crime innovation, but also recognize that what that means is data informed, evidence informed, being attentive to sort of measuring what the new interventions are that you're trying, but also and trying to figure out if they work, and if they don't work, try to shut them down quickly and then try something new, but recognize that there has to be a degree of failure in the process, and that we need to be stretching ourselves, and that if we're too committed to just sort of an evidence-based approach, we're going to move way too slowly on these issues.
I completely agree, and obviously we need to be testing new ideas, but we need to be watching them carefully so we can learn from them what works and what doesn't. I forgot my own rule. We're going to get 2 questions now with 6 minutes left. So one over here, then one over there.
Hi, everyone. My name is Adam Foss. I run an organization called Prosecutor Impact. Thank you all for being here. Nick, data guy. This is awesome. Everybody's awesome. You guys are awesome. Really appreciate the work that we've been doing for many, 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 many years. What the concern that I have sitting back here is that a lot of people have talked about dealing with the low-hanging fruit, the minor cases, and concentrating on the violent and dangerous crime. And to me, as I watch prison populations drop, I see racial disparity going up, and that particularly affects people that look just like me. And so I'm wondering, when we're talking about focusing on and concentrating on violent crime, what that means, given that we understand about poverty and trauma and guns. I want there to be hope that that doesn't mean that we're just gonna lock all the people that are doing violent things away for a really long time.
Before we answer, just get one more question in. So one more question over here. Is there a question here? Then we'll answer both.
Good morning. Dean Esserman, acknowledged friend of Ron SERPAS and Nick Turner. I started as a prosecutor in New York and then became a police chief of several cities, including Providence and New Haven, which is how we know each other. And I'm proud to be part of Leeds and part of the first walking tour for Ron SERPAS of New York City, which I showed him my hometown.
Then he left me and I got lost.
You found your way, brother. I think if I have a lesson learned looking back on being a chief for 25 years in America, it's not to forget the people who do the work. I thought I was taken by your talk of the movement of the corrections officers when you were with them. Police officers live in a suspended state of animation. They spend 20 or 30 years on the same job, and all of them don't become police chiefs. I imagine corrections officers are the same. All of them don't become wardens or directors. There was a time when unions were called guilds, and they were part of the body of the work. They were part of learning the craft. As a police chief, this might be odd, but I've become a union advocate because I've come to realize that we've marginalized unions to be about pay and benefits and job security instead of the culture and the art. So I would hope that one of the things we could learn in this remarkable place of John Jay, and now that I'm with the Police Foundation in Washington, is that it's not just the leaders. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean. I didn't want to call Dean out. I've known him a long time, and he's one of our forward-leaning chiefs, has done a lot of progressive things. On this question of violent crime, here, right here at John Jay, David Kennedy has come up with some very effective ways. I used them in Nashville with the drug market intervention, and we used them in New Orleans with the group violence reduction. But I think the centerpiece of that is not only do you identify through good metrics, through good investigations, through good intelligence, who are truly very dangerous people, but you identify for them they can get out, I should say. You identify for them doorways that they can choose to not be as violent. But people who decide to shoot one another generally look like, I knew the person, I was mad at him, I found him, I shot him. That's not the same as the people who transact violent death and destruction through the use of firearms. They're a little bit different, and we can generally find them. But I will say, after using David's ideas twice, I think the distinction is find a door for them to get out of violence after we know who the violent people are, and we can still deal with the ultimate violent folks who choose not to take that door.
Adam, I hope that in dealing with violent offenders and violent crime, what we actually do is we resist the tendency to use labels like violent offenders because it's generally meaningless. It paints an image in the same way that in my presentation, the picture of Willie Horton, that's what it triggers for people, but there is a broad spectrum of conduct and a broad spectrum of people who get labeled in that way, and that's obfuscating and it's not helpful, and then we decide, fine, we're just gonna put them away, so I think we need to move away from that. And then the second thing is that we need to be bold about thinking about a range of alternatives and policies that that start to not give up on that population and recognize that these are human beings who may have made a mistake, or there may be conduct that they need to address, but that they can address it, and that alternatives are available, and not have that be sort of like the, you know, the Maginot line that is incapable of being crossed. So I think that's what I believe is really important in terms of dealing with that particular issue.
And I just want to hold up something. I mean, Vera has incubated projects and innovative projects that took that chance about trying to figure out other models like restorative justice and Daniel Sured's common justice, which is now just spinning off and becoming its own. But I do think that that just bears mentioning. It kind of goes to another question too, which is we're not just trying to kind of deal with one part of this population, but actually to think through and really unpack the words that we've been using in our criminal justice system and kind of the demonization of certain populations, and figuring out what are new and innovative ways to have different models that are actually meet the person at the human level, bring victims and perpetrators together and the like, to actually have meaningful conversations about alternative ways to break that cycle. And because in a lot of ways, as we all know, these folks are coming from the same communities, and it isn't, I just think it's a very dangerous thing for us to just, as you said, draw this Maginot line without really thinking this through. And that's the pernicious thing that happens when you kind of just talk about nonviolent offenders and violent offenders.
I want to add one piece of data around violent crime that I think Nick, the data guy, would love. So at ARC, we have 500 plus members, and none are nonviolent drug offenders. Every single person, all of the 500 committed violent crime. It's the only population I know, it's the only population I've worked with. In California, our non-violent, our non-serious, non-violent, non-sex offenders that were part of realignment and other stuff, their recidivism is about 90%. The murderer in California that spends 20 years behind bars and is paroled, over the last 50 years, every single one looked at by CDC, our own corrections department, the recidivism rate is 1%. And for all the juvenile lifers that Governor Brown has let out over the last 3 years, Carlos, raise your hand, you're one of them. For all the juvenile lifers that Governor Brown has let out, over 4,000 over the last couple years, or over the last 3 years, the recidivism rate is 0.5%. And those juvenile lifers are only in there for murder, attempted murder, assault with a deadly weapon, the three most violent crimes. So I just want to, the question is, again, are we putting people there we're scared of or mad at? And once someone has shown they have changed, if that change happens at 10 years, why do we need to keep them 30 years? To me, that's the real question. And do we want the non coming out on the street and with a 90% recidivism rate, or do we want to treat them? And on the second thing, do we want to keep the 0.5% recidivists in prison for 30 more years when we know they can change, and like Louie, who committed a violent crime, can come back and mentor kids to not follow in his footsteps?
Scott, you had the last word, full of wisdom. I want to thank all of the panelists here for sharing so much insight into the system, and for calling back up Ed Chung to tell us what to do from here.
So let's, one more time as our panelists exit the stage. Thank you all.